Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Fighting for the Freedom to Learn, Examining the Nation's Centuries-Old School Choice Movement is more than just a fantastic title. This excellent and informative book dives into America's complicated and fascinating educational history. Co-editors and chapter authors Neal McCluskey and James Shuls join the podcast today to explore the evolution of American education, debunk myths surrounding the origin of school choice, and discuss the wide variety of educational options and funding mechanisms and the opponents to those through the nation's history. We cover the old Deluder Satan Act, Horace Mann, James Blaine, the Massive Resistance, and even the KKK, so buckle up. Neal McCluskey is the director of the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. He's the author and co-editor of multiple books and the creator of Cato's Public Schooling Battle Map. James Shuls is the head of the Education Liberty Branch at the Institute for Governance and Civics at Florida State University and a senior fellow at the Show Me Institute. Neal McCluskey and James Shuls, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I had to have you because you have a book by the same name. Fighting for the Freedom to Learn, Examining America's Centuries-Old School Choice Movement. So glad that we're talking about Freedom to Learn on Freedom to Learn.
To be clear, we were not fighting for your podcast, although it is a happy coincidence.
It is a great coincidence. And just to be clear, I'm not having you on the podcast just because of the title of your book. But this was a really enjoyable read. You all found 12 authors, including yourselves, to write 12 chapters. And you bring fascinating historical developments and colorful characters to life. What prompted you to write your chapters and to create this book?
As is often the case with anything I do, it's because I started to get aggravated by something. And it has long sort of stuck in my craw first that opponents of school choice love to say that school choice started with people trying to avoid integration after Brown v. Board of Education. In other words, that school choice is really about segregation and racism. And of course, that was in 1954, was Brown v. Board. And you do have people who start to, say, well, let's have the ability to choose something else. Of course, they shut down public schools completely. So that was one side of it. And that's the side that usually gets me going on something. I'm mad. But there's another part of this, and it's from people that I really like. But on the pro-school choice side, people always tend to say, at least the modern school choice movement started with Milton Friedman. And we always kind of start there, again, in the 1950s. And I think it's important that people know that the history of school choice is much further back than the 50s. And so people who are pro and con need to know that. And then, so I was mad and I contacted James. I'm like, well, that guy's probably mad too about something. But I said, what do you think about doing this edited history volume? And he said, Neal, you're a genius. Of course we should do that. And then the rest was
That's
history.
a direct quote.
Yeah.
That is absolutely a direct quote. I am a person who's been involved in the school choice movement for a long time. I have PhDs in education policy. You could say I'm a disciple of the great Patrick Wolf. I took a school choice seminar with Patrick Wolf. I had been writing about school choice for a long time. And then one day, I'm writing a paper for an organization, and I come across this citation to a group called Citizens for Educational Freedom. I start digging in. I find more about this guy named Virgil Bloom, who was writing in the 50s and 60s, all the way up until his death in 1990. And it was a man who had a tremendous impact on the school choice literature, on the movement, and yet I had never heard of him. And when I talk to other people, they say, oh, I'd never heard of this guy. And if you Google him and look even on Google Scholar, you'll find almost no references to Virgil Bloom. And yet he was much more prolific, at least from the 50s to the early 80s, in writing about school choice than Milton Friedman was. And this is not to say, Neal and I both love Milton Friedman, so none of this is a knock on Milton Friedman. But Bloom was doing tremendous work and gets almost absolutely no credit. And so I started writing some pieces about that, and that's what I think came to Neal's attention. And so I guess you could say I was angry that a lot of this wonderful research about school choice, and part of what it was is not just the figures, but the arguments that they were making. I felt like there were arguments that people were making in the past that we had lost, and we were not making those arguments anymore. And so part of my effort was to recover some of the arguments that people used to make about school choice, because I think they're still relevant today. And so, Neal reached out to me and said, "Hey, why don't we do a book on this, highlighting the fact that school choice is not new. It didn't start with Friedman or with racism," and I was all on board.
Well, I definitely want to delve into your work, your chapter, James, but we have to go way back in history first because that's what your book does, and talk about some of the other educational options that were out there at the beginning of our country. Throughout the early chapters of the book, we learn about dame schools, parson schools, charity schools, old field schools, grammar schools, town schools, academies, night schools, Sunday schools, and of course, common schools. Did I miss any?
Probably.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That was an amazing list, though. I sure couldn't rattle them off.
We
like
might
that.
have missed some. I mean, there's so many different ones.
I wish I'd written that down.
So I mean, we're gonna, as we march forward in the history, we'll talk about Catholic schools, but I do think that it's an important. It's important for us to realize that American education did not start as one thing or two things: public schools and private religious schools, public schools and Catholic schools. There was this diversity of option, and it varied widely by region and by the history of the colony or the states, by the influence of the faith that was predominant in that particular area. And then as industrialization came along, by the needs of the local community. What were some of the objectives that these different types of schools hope to achieve from your perspective?
The first important thing to take from these chapters, basically up to common schooling, and we start the common schooling movement. 1837 is when Horace Mann becomes the first secretary of the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. And a lot of people think, and if you read some historians who are actually really educationists, that, okay, well, basically people were ignorant until we start common schooling. And what I really think is important is people understand, no, Americans were not ignorant. There was a whole lot of education happening in a whole lot of different ways before this idea of common schooling, or, that government runs schools. And what you found was that people were pursuing all sorts of things. One, people wanted their kids to be literate, probably first and foremost, so that they could understand the Bible and religion. But that was hardly the only thing. We got to realize that around the same time, what is huge is newspapers and pamphlets and people involved and political debates. All of that needs literacy. So people wanted their kids to be able to do that. They wanted to be able to engage in those things themselves. And so we actually had very rich education with all sorts of different aims, some religious, some political, some culture. And there was a fair amount, Jane Shaw Stroup in her chapter talks about this, of people going to for-profit schools even to learn skills that would enable them to be better in business or more successful in their lives. So the important takeaway is there was lots of education with lots of different purposes, because people are all different and they all have different things they need and want. And we had an education system that reflected that.
Adding to that, in many cases, those schools that Neal was mentioning received some sort of public support, right? Whether it was through land or tax dollars, there wasn't this clear demarcation between what was public and private. There was an intermingling of public and private, and that that was the case in early America. There wasn't always the separation of church and state or separation of public school and private school. These were it was a much more mixed system in early America.
Right. And certainly faith played a big part of those educational options early on. A number of your authors seem to enjoy mentioning the old Deluder Satan Act of 1647. James, you want to tell us what that was?
Yeah, I mean, the old deluder Satan, right? Satan, his goal is to delude you, right? To make you ignorant. And so to combat Satan, the Massachusetts legislature said each community had to create schools to teach students to read the Bible so they can combat that old deluder Satan, right? So it's the earliest, public school requirement for education in our country, that specifically mentions the purpose of schooling being to read the Bible. And, so there's clearly religious aims in the earliest school laws in this nation. Well, I guess it wasn't in the nation yet. It was a colony at the time.
And it's worth noting that those schools, and in some places, depending on the size of your town, where you had to have a school or just a person to educate, but they weren't actually expected to be free. People were expected to pay for them. So when somebody tells you public schooling started with the old Deluder Satan Act and just grew from there, the old Deluder Satan Act was not like public schooling the way we think about it now. There also wasn't compulsory schooling, although Massachusetts and Virginia and others said, look, if you don't educate your child at all, they can be sent somewhere for education, usually an apprenticeship. In fact, they said put out for apprenticeship. And that old Deluder Satan wasn't replicated really outside of New England and wasn't maintained in New England because it often didn't make sense given the priority of the people. So I like to talk about the old Deluder Satan Act because nobody puts Satan in the name of a law anymore. But we need to not hold it up the way that the educationists have in history, who wrote a lot of education history, saying, it's all been one steady movement from ignorance to brilliance because of common schooling, and this was really the start.
Just want to throw out Northwest Ordinance of 1787 apparently includes schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So there was a sense in the early years of our nation's history that education's important. Again, that didn't mean that there was immediately established a system of public education, right?
Yeah. So, what that did was clearly people thought education was important. Notably, the focus was not on, well, we should all be able to read and write and therefore be able to become rich or something. This was always tied into the creation or cultivation of virtuous citizens. And importantly, the Northwest Ordinance says education and religion will be supported. So when people point to that to say, see that, it's also the beginning of public schools. Well, if you say that, then you should say there should be a religious component to public schools. But it reflected that Americans valued education, and they didn't see this bifurcation of public and private. So that money could be used to support education. But again, we need to be careful not to point to that and say, see, we are just put on the road to government control of education, which is what really everybody wanted. At that point in time, that was not an expectation.
Okay, I want to talk about the propagation of the gospel in foreign parts before we have to get to Horace Mann. There are plenty of organizations now who play a role in non-public religious education. The propagation of the gospel in foreign parts is not one of them, but this seemed to be an important part of American education history. It came up again in a few chapters. Do either of you want to touch on that organization?
I am not an expert on that organization, but they certainly come up a lot, again, in colonial and early American history, because especially in that time, religion and education were intimately connected. There was an expectation that religion was central to education for most people. And groups like that were in particular trying to spread literacy in order to enable people to read and understand the Bible, and because literacy was important. And for instance, would have had a lot to do with creation of Sunday schools. So one of the early ways of among many ways of having mass education were Sunday schools, because we have to remember you can't project our present onto the past. Often kids had to work, and they had to work, a lot, especially as they got bigger. They were very valuable in a largely agrarian society. And so a lot of education would happen on Sundays. And so these groups would go and sort of help to spread education among all sorts of people, but with a overtly religious mission.
Okay, so early education in America, there was a great diversity of schooling options funded by a loose blend of public and private sources. And then things started to change in the 1830s. So what happened?
Neal's much more of our common school expert. I'll let you jump in, Neal.
Oh, well, okay. Well, actually, so Charlie Glenn is our big common school expert, and this is his chapter. But basically, you have, especially in New England's where all the concentration of power seems to start to accumulate first. But you have first a change in kind of the religion. So that's all no longer sort of Puritan and Congregationalist, but it is more Unitarian. And Horace Mann is an elite. And like many elites, he's Unitarian. That doesn't necessarily explain why he supports public schooling or common schooling. But one thing he's concerned about is he didn't like the old religion, and a lot of schools were religious. But in particular, he becomes alarmed because you have the beginning of industrialization in New England. It's a relatively poor farming area compared to other parts of the country, but it's got lots of rivers and things. And you might remember your early factories with the big wheel. The big wheel, powered by water, powered the factory. And he started to see basically people from outside of these urban and now burgeoning industrial areas coming in from the outskirts. And Horace Mann said, ugh, these people are gross. I mean, that's basically what it came down to. He felt they were backwards, that they were uneducated, they had poor hygiene, and his goal was to try and shape these people into better citizens, safer citizens. And I actually think he was well intended. It's easy to bash Horace Mann, and I will certainly do some of that. But I think he really thought, I have the answers. These people don't, and I need to rescue these children. If you read enough Horace Mann, you get sort of shocked by what a huge paternalist he is. And so he thought we needed common schools, not just to educate kids, but to educate entire families. So, for instance, he writes about, families should invite the teacher into their home so the teacher can educate all of them on such things as hand washing, which is reasonable, and also phrenology, which Horace Mann believed in, but is not as reasonable. And so a lot of this was wanting to create schools that were common, that were run by elites in order to take regular people and make them more like the elites. Part of that was religious. Part of it was sort of would make them into Unitarians. I don't actually know that was his intent, but he was accused of that because he said we have to remove everything that's controversial from these schools. And in religion, people said, well, that kind of makes him Unitarian. But his goal was really, I think, a paternalistic control of people he thought were backward more than anything else.
Right. So shaping citizens by the state. These schools were liberating students from the influence of their parents. I think he said something along the lines of like intellectual content should be strictly subordinate to these other goals. I think he thought rather highly of himself. I feel like you put that a little more gently, Neal. He said something along the lines of the common school is the greatest discovery made by man. Okay, dude.
Yeah. Yes. He was definitely a salesman because the idea of common schooling was not particularly popular. It was almost struck down not long after he gets into his position because people didn't like the government telling everyone what to do. And there were people who disagreed with him on religion in particular, which Charlie Glenn writes about. It said, wait a minute, you're going to sort of impose schooling on us that removes all the things we think are important in education and in religion. And we won't accept that. So much of what he's doing is a sales job, and a sales job often means making great pronouncements of everything your snake oil can do. And in that regard, problematic, but probably not different from people who try to sell you lots of things.
Now, were the common schools invented before or after sliced bread? I don't know where that fits in terms of the best invention, but you bring up, Jenny, the point of common schools being to form the American citizen. And the common schools were supported in large part by a lot of the Protestants. The Protestants wanted to create a system of non-sectarian private schools that had Protestant Bible reading, that were Protestant in many ways. And that's why we get this separate Catholic system, with the Catholics sort of rebelling against the public school system and creating their own system of schools. And that's partly why you don't have strong systems of Protestant schools from the different Protestant denominations. By and large, Protestant denominations bought into the common school movement and supported it because they were the dominant when you talk about the elites, I mean, Protestants were the dominant class in America at that point in time. So if you go back and look at Protestant magazines and writing of the time, many of the prominent Protestants were supporting the common school movement. And that's partly how it gets the support that it had at that time, because they were pushing a religion in the schools that was the dominant religion of the United States. And then, of course, over time, all of that gets stripped out, and we're left with public school system that doesn't have any Protestantism in it anymore. But that vision at the beginning was to create a system that was religious. It just was of a non-sectarian Protestant variety.
I think we do need to talk about the role of like immigration and the concerns about Catholics. And Neal, you mentioned that Mann wasn't necessarily universally beloved. You know, there was some success and then pulling back on his mission, but ultimately the common school model prevailed. So that was around this concern about all these Catholics coming in, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, importantly, when Horace Mann gets started, there are not a lot of Catholics. So a lot of people think it started with anti-Catholicism. It actually didn't. It really was more about he didn't like people who weren't like him. And that could have been all sorts of ignorance. But it's not long after that you have a lot of Catholics arrive. And as James said, you know, the thought for most people at the time period was, well, a proper American is Protestant. And there were concerns, you know, that the Catholic Church sometimes was involved in a lot of politics, and they said, well, that's a problem. So you have Catholics arrive, and that's the first group, though, that's very different and can't accept what Horace Mann's sort of compromise was on religion, which is we will have the Bible present in the schools. People accused him of trying to remove it. They said, no, I definitely want it there. It is the only true expositor of the Christian religion, but it won't be interpreted in any way in the schools. And Catholics show up and say, well, actually, we kind of need it interpreted.
And we don't like the King James Bible, and don't
That's
make us
right.
recite it.
We want our Douay-Rheims Bible, and it would have annotation. And they say, well, no, you can't have that. Plus, real Americans don't use that. They use the King James. And of course, this varies from community to community. So I'm speaking very broadly. But so you have this big problem. We end up with things like, which I'm not even sure whether we wrote about, somebody wrote about in the book, but for instance, the Philadelphia Bible riots of the 1840s, which are two rounds of basically in-street warfare in the Philadelphia region, so Philadelphia and some outskirts, over whose version of the Bible will be in the schools. And that suggests that this system that is one of the things we're supposed to get is unifying diverse people, forces them into conflict. So anyway, so one big problem is it's hard to incorporate Catholics in this because they need something different. And many people think that what is different is un-American. But it's also important to note, as I write about in my chapter, which starts 1880, goes to 1955, is people are worried about more than just Americans who are Catholic. They're really worried about Germans. And until I wrote this chapter, I didn't realize how worried everybody was about Germans. But you start in the 1880s, but you go on, so through World War I and World War II, where you can sort of see why this is the case. But even before that, they say, we're really worried about people who speak German and live in Germanic communities. Some are Catholics, some are Lutherans, some would be various sort of like Scandinavian denominations, but they would all be speaking German. And there was sort of a war on people speaking German, both in public schools and in private schools. And so Catholics are a problem, but the idea is everybody should have to be one version of what the right American is. Catholics were probably the most on the outside of people that they would sort of try and integrate. Obviously, we have African Americans who we talk about. They say, oh, we're not even going to offer them education. But it's a big problem of people who don't fit a mold are sort of under siege and are either having to not use common schooling because they're not allowed, or it's not acceptable, or if they enter, it'll be to force their kids into what is considered by elites to be a proper American.
Yeah, I want to add to what Neal was saying about the Protestants and the difference between Protestants and Catholics. And today I don't think we can fully comprehend the difference between those two groups and the animosity that existed. I mean, today if you're a non-Christian, you just sort of see these two things as almost the same. And if you are a Protestant or a Catholic, maybe there's some good-natured ribbing going on every now and again, maybe some inappropriate jokes about Catholics or something along those lines. But in the 1800s, there was legitimate anger between these two groups. I mean, in the riots that Neal's talking about, people died. And you look at Protestant writings, and they're calling the Pope the Antichrist, right? I mean, there was legitimate anger and animosity between these two groups that helped fuel some of this. It wasn't only that, but it certainly was a huge boon or a catalyst to the support among Protestants for the common school system.
Well, I don't want to skip over the anti-literacy laws and the things that just make your blood boil reading them that kept Black Americans, particularly slaves, from learning to read. That's covered in the book. These are really important and really horrific parts of our nation's history, and so it's good that those were covered. I do want to keep delving into this anti-Catholicism that was brewing in the 1800s, because we have to talk about James Blaine before we can understand what's going on in the newish dividing line between public and private schools. So we've got this kind of anti-Catholic, nativist, anti-immigrant fervor in the country, and along comes James Blaine. So, James, do you want to talk about who he was?
Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. Right. So that was the campaign slogan against him when he ran for president. And Blaine wanted to push through in the Congress these laws that would prohibit funding going to religious institutions, particularly sectarian institutions that were Catholic, right? And it fails narrowly at the federal level by just a handful of votes. But then these Blaine amendments start getting pushed into state constitutions, prohibiting funds from going to religious institutions, and again, targeted directly at Catholic institutions, because as we've already talked about, funding was going to religious institutions already before this, and this is targeted at removing those funds from Catholic institutions, Catholic schools. So you see states adopting Blaine amendments in their state constitutions, and then you even see, following the Civil War, some requirement for these types of amendments to be included in state constitutions as states re-enter the Union. 37 states with explicit prohibitions on funding going to Catholic institutions and religious institutions. And so this is what ends up being a tremendous obstacle to school choice programs. But you should read the chapter on the sort of evolution of the law related to this, because it also talks about how this is starting to be overturned in the courts these days.
Well, and the Catholic leaders at the time weren't just taking it. You had a bishop named John Hughes that popped up in a number of chapters, very active in the 1800s in ensuring that the Catholic schools were established and, as much as possible, receiving funding. And then, James, I think we're about to your period of history, where there was a particular organization set up that was to help further that cause. So, Neal, we're skipping over your chapter, but your chapter kind of addresses this quiet period, right?
Oh, it is perfectly fine to skip over my chapter because it is quiet, and I just try to explain why it's quiet. And actually, when I mentioned the Germans, that's really a big part of it. Is throughout that period, private schooling is under attack just as its ability to exist. And if you're fighting for your mere existence, you're probably not also fighting to get money. And a lot of that is anti-immigrant. Some of it is anti-Catholic. Of course, all those things are wrapped together. And then you don't get till really you can say late 1940s, but 1950s. But then that gets right into what James is about to talk about as kind of part of this revival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the organization you mentioned was called Citizens for Educational Freedom. They formed in St. Louis in 1959, really at the inspiration of a guy named Father Virgil Bloom. Father Bloom was a political science professor at Marquette University, did his dissertation at St. Louis University, and he had been writing about education in the 1950s from a perspective of civil rights, essentially saying religious schools, especially Catholic schools, shouldn't lose the public benefit of funding for education simply because they're religious or simply because parents choose. And he was suggesting people should organize and push for these rights. He was motivated by seeing the civil rights movement and this tremendous success that Black Americans were having, and said religious Americans need to organize and fight in the same sort of way for our rights. And so the motivation in the chapter, I start talking about how people today will say, school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. And the point is, no, it's always been a civil rights issue. We have discriminated against people. This is the argument Bloom would make, solely based on their choosing of a school. And when they choose not to send to the public school that they're assigned to, they lose out on the public education benefit. And that's particularly the case for people who want a Christian or a religious school of some sort. They lose out on the public benefit because they choose. And so Bloom writes this book in 1959, Freedom of Choice in Education. It helps launch Citizens for Educational movement and this tremendous push for school choice throughout the 60s, which, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that some people like to say was started by racists fighting against segregation in the South. But if you look at Citizens for Educational Freedom, almost all of their members are in the North. Almost all the movement they have is in the North. And there was a quote in the book where I think it's Bloom or someone who says something like, not a week goes by that the New York Times isn't talking about Citizens for Educational Freedom. I mean, they were pushing on all fronts, whether that was tuition support or money for books or money for buses or all kinds of things. And yet we're told today, this all started because of either Friedman or the racists in the South. And the record's clear that that's simply not the case. There was tremendous support for school choice, that when Bloom enters the picture in the 50s, he's building on all of the movement that's happened before, and he's using these arguments around rights to make a case for school choice that launches a movement that really had, I think, significant implications. I mean, it's part of the reason we have Title I funds, the federal government funds that are allowed to go to private schools, partly because of this movement that you see from Bloom and Citizens for Educational Freedom.
Well, the funds are allowed to go to students enrolled in non-public schools, so
Right.
that those students can benefit both from Title I and IDEA.
But that wasn't given, right? When those laws were being proposed and the unions were supporting them, they did not want any funds going to private or non-public schools. And that was a fight that Citizens for Educational Freedom was a part of, and so were other groups.
James, we do need to address the accusations that the massive resistance, the closing of public schools, and then providing vouchers for white students to attend private academies, that has something to do with the education freedom movement, with the school choice movement. You refer to it as a flash in the pan, and a stain.
I mean, you look at it, the real purpose in the South, the thing that they wanted was segregated public schools. That's what they were fighting for. They were not fighting for educational freedom in the same way that Neal and I are fighting for educational freedom, for people to have the ability to choose the school that aligns with their values and their vision of a quality education. They were fighting for segregated public schools. And when they would get challenged, when they wouldn't integrate schools, the Southern legislatures, especially in Virginia, which is the one I highlight in the chapter, they would close the public schools. Right? It wasn't like they were integrating them and then also creating some sort of voucher program to expand educational opportunities. No, they closed public schools, and then they also offered vouchers to people that could be used to go to private schools. And so the choice people were making wasn't between an integrated public school and a segregated private school. It was between no school and a private school. And so do we have segregation academies pop up? Yes. And were some of them there because their mission was to, serve white students? Yes. But that wasn't the whole story, right? So you have to acknowledge the whole story, that there were racists, there were segregationists, but the primary effort and goal for them was to create a segregated public school system. The idea of using vouchers to help support this, resistance in the South, it's true that it occurred. It's true that there's some racist elements to it, but every program that was created with racist intent was struck down. It was unconstitutional in the same way that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, right? So that's the flash in the pan. They created them, they're struck down, they're no more. You cannot, racially segregate private schools today. Those laws of the 50s or 60s do not resemble the laws of today. They're not the forebears. They're, as I said, as you quoted, a flash in the pan, and they're a stain that we have to deal with, but they're not the whole story.
You point out that at the time that this was happening, the Virginia Catholic schools were desegregating.
Right. That's one of the funny points is there's a Protestant magazine that was anti-Catholic schools, and it was affiliated with sort of the Protestants and other Americans united for the separation of church and state, right? So the Protestants said, those Catholics who normally always are begging for public dollars, they're not involved with this voucher movement in the South right now. Because the Catholic schools, first off, some of those voucher programs, they were not allowing dollars to go to private schools like Catholic schools. And so the Catholics were actually advocating against some of these voucher programs because they weren't included in them. And they were already desegregated or in the process of desegregating in many of these states. And so you had an omission by the Protestants who were opposed to vouchers that on this matter, the Catholics in the South were actually pretty good.
Anything else to talk about in this era? I mean, it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but it is important to address.
Well, I think, the chapter tries to give a fuller picture of the history, right? To say this segregation time period is absolutely, it is a real time period where there was real controversy and vouchers were in the mix. But if we use that time period to stain vouchers, it must absolutely be a stain on the public school system too, because it was the public schools who were segregated first and that they were fighting to maintain segregation of. Mm-hmm. So if anyone today tries to use this argument, vouchers in the 50s or 60s, they were, supporting segregation, so were the public schools, right? And so I think it's a silly or a moot point. Let's look at the full history of it. Let's recognize that those programs then are not the same thing as the programs we have today. It's part of the history, but it's not the whole story.
And those sorts of accusations that school choice is grounded in racism are the sort of thing that makes you mad and makes you want to put together a book that goes through the history so that people know better.
And again, a very good book that was very enjoyable. You all do mention, and your authors mention, that this wasn't just a voucher fight, that sometimes it was just public funds for transportation or for textbooks. And there are states that have had those in place for a really long time. So that sort of information, I think, gets lost, that there has really never been this sharp dividing line between public, private, secular, and religious schools. There's always been this kind of blend for a variety of reasons. Are there any education myths that are addressed in the book that you'd want to address today as we're wrapping up?
So the biggest myth that this was about dispelling was this idea that school choice starts, or the idea of educational pluralism starts in, racism. It simply doesn't. And I do think it's important, Ginny, you mentioned that, there were actually, so before you get to the 1950s, starting in the 30s and 40s, and I had forgotten about this till I wrote my chapter, there were these efforts to help people not necessarily pay directly for school, but at least have some defraying of costs with equal access to things like transportation and textbooks. There was, of course, a lot of tension there saying, well, how much is too much where you're helping sectarian institutions? Sectarian, again, was like shorthand for Catholic because the public schools were still kind of de facto Protestant, even in the 30s and 40s. It's not really till the 60s where the Supreme Court says you have to remove any sort of education. Even starting in the 30s and 40s, you start to have, again, this idea that government actually shouldn't be totally against. You're choosing schools and education and even religious and even Catholic education.
Neal, I feel we'd be remiss in finishing up this conversation without addressing the role that the KKK played in our nation's education history. Do you want to share that story from Oregon?
Sure. I'm not a KKK expert, thankfully, but they do have a role, and I think actually their role is reflective in the extreme, but reflective of a lot of things that are happening in around, we'll say, from like 1900 to they kind of peter out again by 1930. But the KKK kind of changes a little. So you think of the KKK after the Civil War, and they're clearly about racism and trying to reimpose the old social structures in the South. But they go away, but they resurface probably around the 1920s. And largely more in the Midwest, actually, than in the South, but also some in the Pacific Northwest. And they are kind of a mix of basically they still don't like African Americans, but they don't like Catholics, but they also don't like immigrants. They also don't like elites. So there are all sorts of people they don't like. And one of the ways they sort of express this is trying to end private schooling. And they tried to end it by saying, they tried it in other places, but it ends up passing by a referendum in Oregon saying, in order to meet your compulsory education requirements, it has to be done in a public school. And that will de facto kill private schools. And of course, then you have two schools. Ultimately, the case is called Pierce v. Society of Sisters. So people think, well, this is all about Catholics. But they're joined by, so Society of Sisters runs Catholic schools, but something called Hill Military Academy, which is non-sectarian. It's a military school. And they sue to say this referendum, which was driven by the Ku Klux Klan, as well as other sort of kind of like disaffected lower middle class, generally speaking, lower middle class folks who are just kind of mad about the whole way America is changing, that this is unacceptable to say that everybody has to be educated in a public school. And of course, in 1925, then, the schools win in Pierce v. Society of Sisters. And then the Klan, again, which is having a bit of a resurgence, it actually kind of falls apart from internal dissension, and it's got a lot of scandals. But it is really, it represents many people who just don't want change, basically, and who are sort of highly suspicious of elites who also use private schools. So they don't like Catholics, they don't like immigrants, they don't like African Americans, and they don't like these sort of, hoity-toity people who like to tell them what to do. And so they are trying to impose kind of a uniformity again on society in a way that they're comfortable with, making Americans as they think they should be, which is kind of sort of Protestant, regular working people types.
Neal, the more I learn about the KKK, the less I like them.
They deserve their bad publicity, from what I can tell.
For sure. Yes, in the 1800s, 1900s, none of it good. That's for sure. All right, so this book has a wonderful title, Fighting for the Freedom to Learn. Where can people find it?
Oh, well, I mean, it's as James has said, it's on all your electronic books. Actually, James, you put it better than I did in a tweet recently. What was it you said?
Your local electronic bookstores?
Yes,
Yeah.
there you go. But it was moving so fast for a little while. It was out of stock in Amazon. If you see that, though, you can always go to Cato's website. We've got a store. You'd have to Google like Cato Bookstore, and you can get it there. But Barnes & Noble, Amazon, some others, it's available through all of them.
Highly recommend that everyone read this. Again, very enjoyable book. How can people follow y'all's work?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Shulsy.
And Neal?
I'm at Neal McCluskey. You can also go to the Center for Educational Freedom at Cato, and definitely check out the book and check out all the contributors. They are all people you want to follow. They're not all as on social media as James and I are, so good for them. But all really great people to know and to learn from.
Well, Neal and James, thank you for this book, and thank you for your commitment to education freedom, and thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.